that, there is little reason to believe that the issue is having much impact on this campaign. So why raise it yet again? Precisely because the president's denials have been so emphatic, while the evidence contradicting those denials keeps mounting, we felt that we should present the story in all its parts, together with new information that became available in the past few days, one more time.
There wasn't one single iota of evidence that any U.S. weapons were on that battlefield, and the nuclear capability has been searched by the United Nations, and there hasn't been one single scintilla of evidence that there's any U.S. technology involved in it.
Well, it's certainly not true that there's not a single scintilla of evidence.
David Kay headed up several teams of UN inspectors to search suspected nuclear sites in Baghdad. As you may recall, he and one of his teams were held at gunpoint in a Baghdad parking lot.
From first-hand observation, that is, walking around the sites where both missiles and nuclear weapons, parts of nuclear weapons process were produced, you see machine tools, some of whom come from the United States. You see oscillographs, other precision instrumentation, also from the United States. You see a lot of computers that are U.S. produced.
They were dual-use items that were generally available and of little consequence, of no consequence, in fact, to the programs that Iraq had.
You'll be hearing a lot about dual-use technology this evening. A machine, for example, that can turn out a perfectly harmless pipe can also turn out a gun barrel.
We had a policy on dual use. We had a policy to screen to be sure that key elements did not go for nuclear weapons or for arms. Now, if a Tandy computer or an IBM personal computer ends up somewhere in a nuclear program, too bad. But the policy was to not do that.
That's not a legitimate, at least in my view, a legitimate escape to say, oh, we only sold them dual use. That is the type of technology that you have to exercise almost the highest degree of responsibility because it is potentially misused.
One clear example of dangerous dual-use technology is machine tools. For months, we've been following a trail of documents showing how a Fortune 500 company, Kenna Metal of Latrobe, Pennsylvania, shipped tungsten carbide cutting tools to companies in Europe. We were never able to connect all the dots to demonstrate that those tools actually ended up in the Iraqi military program. But now David Kay tells us he knows how they were used in Iraq.
Well, I don't know the route they proceeded to get there, but they certainly made it to the program. There were at Al Athir, which was the major weaponization site for the Iraqi nuclear weapons program, where the actual weapons would have been manufactured and assembled, one substantial building, a building we call the Tungsten Carbide Building, which in fact had products from that company.
In fact, between 1985 and the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the Commerce Department approved at least 220 export licenses for the Iraqi armed forces, major weapons complexes, and enterprises identified by the Central Intelligence Agency as diverting technology to weapons programs.
Indeed, there was an ongoing battle between the Commerce Department, which was promoting the sale of U.S. technology, and the Defense Department, which was trying to prevent the transfer of dual-use technology that was potentially dangerous. You'd think the Pentagon would have a lot of clout in that respect, but according to former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Steve Bryan, whose job it was to stop the transfer of U.S. weapons technology, the Reagan-Bush administrations lined up behind commerce.
Well, the administration was very strong to encourage U.S. companies to go to Iraq and do business there. And a lot of that was sold was going right into the military programs. For U.S. companies selling computers that went into a huge complex called SOD-16, which is a missile development complex, they had to know exactly what they were being used for, but they were being encouraged by the administration. Other companies sold machines and furnaces and equipment where they were misled. They were told it was for civilian use when in fact it was for a military purpose.
For example, in 1989, an American company, Consark, got a request from Iraq for a number of furnaces that could be used for melting titanium. The purpose, the Iraqis said, was to build artificial limbs for the thousands of Iraqi soldiers who'd been wounded in the war with Iran. But furnaces that can melt titanium can also melt zirconium, which is used in nuclear reactor work. The president of Consark's parent company, Henry Rowan, warned the Commerce Department on several occasions.
About a week later, they sent a representative to Consark to study this further with us, and again we repeated these same warnings, the same concerns that we had for the dual use, and that was the beginning and the end of that discussion, and they continued to encourage us to quote on the equipment and obtain the order and build the equipment.
The U.S. Embassy in Baghdad tracked the negotiations.
And when we got the signed order, or the letter of intent really, from the Iraqis, we got a telegram from the embassy which read, "Hurrah for you. If we can help further, please let us know."
It wasn't until July 23rd of 1990, just about 10 days before the Iraqis invaded Kuwait, that Pentagon objections and apparently some early Iraqi troop movements convinced President Bush to block the shipment of those furnaces to Baghdad. Last year, when Congress started investigating just what had been sent to Iraq and where it ultimately ended up, the Commerce Department engaged in something of a shell game. Some items were left off the list presented to Congress. Items, for example, which were sent to an Iraqi Missile and Research Development Center. 68 export documents had been altered by the Commerce Department. One of the simplest examples involved removing the word military from the phrase military trucks. And just yesterday, ABC News Nightline obtained a list compiled by government investigators documenting nearly 200 items sent by American companies to Iraqi military and nuclear installations. President Bush's claims to the contrary notwithstanding. It might be funny if it weren't so serious, the degree to which different U.S. government agencies, but especially the Commerce Department, encourage the government of Iraq to bamboozle them.
The most spectacular case is the flying tractor case.
Gary Mulholland heads up an organization called the Wisconsin Project, which tracks nuclear developments around the world. He's become something of a specialist on Iraq. This week, he testified before Congress.
The Iraqis said they wanted special relay switches, which were perfect for separating the stages of ballistic missiles in flight. They wanted these special relays that would operate at 66 miles above the Earth for tractors. And the Commerce Department said that despite the fact that it didn't make sense, as long as the application said it was for peaceful purposes and civilian use, there was no way to stop it. So it went out.
The administration's policy was to support Saddam Hussein and not to look backwards, not to look sideways, look straight ahead, and give him what he wanted. We coddled him, we supported him, he was our guy. And just because he was building missiles, or just because he had a nuclear potential, CIA warned about that, we know that now for sure, didn't matter. They simply didn't care.
The most recent example of what Steve Bryan was talking about revolves around a Canadian by the name of Gerald Bull. Bull was the inventor of something called the super gun, a huge cannon bigger than any artillery piece you've ever seen that could fire artillery shells with chemical or nuclear weapons literally hundreds of miles. But only this week, a new story about Bull has come to light. When one of his companies, Space Research Corporation of Maryland, applied for a license to ship an advanced computer to Iraq, which ended up being used to test the supergun's ballistics, well, here's what happened.
We knew Jerry Bull was a rocket expert. We knew he had already broken U.S. export laws. We knew he was involved in various rocket programs in the world. And yet when he applied for an export license for a computer and software, we granted it. Now we find out that he apparently used that software and that hardware to design Saddam's first big rocket.
So far, we've only been talking about U.S. equipment and technology that was sent to Iraq under license. But for almost 18 months now, Nightline has also been reporting on covert shipments of such material to Iraq that clearly broke U.S. laws. Covert activities that were known in almost all instances to one or more U.S. government agencies at the time they took place. There was the case of Ishan Barghouti, who was publicly denounced by the U.S. government for setting up a chemical warfare plant for Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in Rabta, Libya, Washington was worried enough about chemical weapons being produced in Libya that the Pentagon drew up contingency plans to bomb the plant. But when the same Dr. Barbuti set up a chemical plant in Boca Raton, Florida in 1988, and even though that information was brought to the attention of the CIA, no action was taken until after Barbuti was dead and the plant was closed, long after Barbuti had shipped samples of cyanide produced by a new process from Boca Raton to Baghdad. We told you about Carlos Cardón, Chile's biggest arms merchant, a man who received recommendations from the State Department, a man with connections to the CIA. Cardón acquired U.S. weapons technology with which he built cluster bomb and munitions factories in Iraq, factories which ultimately were destroyed by U.S. stealth bombers during Operation Desert Storm. And then there was the case of ISC, a U.S. company based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which used a CIA front in a complicated scheme to ship U.S. weapons technology, including ballistic weapons technology, to South Africa. Ultimately, it made its way to Baghdad. The same company also transferred weapons technology to Iraq via Chile. As bits and pieces of these legal and illegal technology transfers to Iraq have become known, members of the Reagan and Bush administrations have denied knowing anything about the illegal activities. As for the legal transfers, which are now almost as controversial, those, it's argued, were part of a larger strategic policy to strengthen Iraq in its war against Iran. After the war ended in 1988, the policy continued as a means of moderating Saddam Hussein's behavior.
What I had knowledge of is that we were trying to work with Saddam Hussein and try to bring him along into the family of nations. And that failed, but I'm glad we tried to do it.
Which brings us to the heart of this story, money. How did Iraq, which was essentially bankrupt after its war with Iran, get the billions of dollars to buy all the weapons and technology it acquired? The answer? A small branch of a big Italian bank in Atlanta, Georgia. That story when we come back. No one now disputes the fact that Saddam Hussein during the 1980s and into 1990 spent billions of dollars buying weapons and technology wherever and however he could acquire it. But where did he get the money? Iraq was essentially bankrupt, and most lenders simply found the financial risk too great. Which brings us to the unlikeliest of places, Atlanta, Georgia, and the tiny branch office of a huge Italian bank known by its initials, BNL.
BNL was the financial linchpin of the arming of Iraq.
Alan Friedman is a reporter for the Financial Times of London. We cooperated on the reporting of this story some 17 months ago.
BNL was an Italian bank in Atlanta, Georgia, that lent $5 billion illegal loans to Saddam Hussein. More than $2 billion of those loans went into his nuclear and chemical weapons programs.
Since $5 billion is, by anyone's standard, a considerable sum of money, and since it later turned out that the loans to Saddam were illegal, it seems fair to ask who arranged the loans and who knew about them. The answer, until very recently, was said to be just one man. This man, Christopher Dragul, the president of BNL Atlanta. The federal government, which brought charges against Dragul, takes the position that nobody else even knew about the illegal loans to Iraq. Not the BNL Home Office in Rome, nor any agencies of the U.S. government. That struck us as highly unlikely even 17 months ago, so we raised it with Norman Bailey, who used to work in the Reagan White House on the National Security Council.
The likelihood of a branch of an Italian bank in Atlanta, Georgia, dealing with the kinds of sums that were involved, not coming to the attention of the authorities, would be almost zero.
Indeed, there was an additional complication. Almost $2 billion worth of loans were guaranteed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and later defaulted on by Saddam Hussein. The so-called CCC program is designed to encourage foreign governments to buy their agricultural products from U.S. farmers. But, as Senator Pat Leahy of the Senate Agricultural Committee points out, money is money.
In this case, he used our money. We gave him money to buy the food. That freed up the money that he had set aside for food, and he could use that to buy weapons, which he did.
So basically you're saying the American taxpayer is going to get hit for how much?
I think the American taxpayer will eventually have to spend $1,900,000,000, which is basically foreign aid to Saddam Hussein.
All relevant agencies of the U.S. government have taken the position that the first they heard of the BNL scandal was August of 1989, when a couple of secretaries at the bank called in the FBI. Branch President Chris Dragul was arrested and charged with defrauding U.S. bank regulators and the Rome headquarters of BNL. But then Congressman Gonzalez of the House Banking Committee revealed the essence of a still classified CIA report.
However, I can say that the analysis in those documents confirms that, quote, more senior BNL officials in Rome, end of quote, in fact, knew what the Atlanta office had been doing, that is, financing important Iraqi military procurement, including the Condor II missile project.
Then, in a truly bizarre development, the judge in the Dragul case, Judge Marvin Shube, questioned the government's motives in this case, criticized the Justice Department, and singled out the CIA for being uncooperative.
I recognized, of course, the government wasn't too happy with my handling of the case.
Then Judge Shube withdrew from the case.
A federal judge in Atlanta issues an order from the bench saying that he feels that those at the highest levels in our government have tried to shape this case.
David Boren is chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee.
There have been inappropriate telephone calls from the White House Legal Counsel's office to the prosecutors in this case. And then in addition to that, we have released by the Justice Department to the public a letter from the CIA, which in essence says the only thing we know about this is what we read in the newspapers. And our committee, our staff, had been reading cables that indicated that the CIA knew a lot about this from non-public sources. So here we have two agencies of government, the CIA, that ought to be telling the whole truth to the court about what it knows, and the Justice Department, which is the conduit for information. The CIA gives the information to justice, they then give it to the court, giving them strong advice not to be thorough and not to be accurate. So I think we have to say here that we have two departments of government that we have to look into very, very thoroughly.
Senator Leahy, is it too extreme to talk about a cover-up here?
Well, I begin to feel there is one when it would first look like just some really bad policy mistakes.
I think we have to say there's very much the possibility of a cover-up, and what a tragedy it would be if we have a cover-up here.
There clearly is the question of how much of the timing is related to politics.
Well, Ted, I don't think anyone would charge me with being too partisan. I was criticized to some degree because I tried to have what I thought was a fair and impartial hearing on the Gates confirmation. We have not had a single party line vote in our committee. But here we have a problem dropped in our lap. We didn't set the timing of it. We didn't know when this matter was going to come to trial and have the judge issue this order in Atlanta. We didn't know when the CIA was going to issue a letter that it itself has now admitted was misleading. We have two agencies of our own government that are now ordering investigations of themselves. Now, for us not to proceed, we would be derelict in our duty. So all I can say is, I think we've demonstrated we run the Intelligence Committee on a bipartisan basis, but we can't look the other way. We won't look the other way when we see something as questionable as we see in this circumstance.
It is easy enough, given the political season, to dismiss charges of a cover-up coming as they do from two Democratic senators as purely partisan. As I told you at the beginning of this broadcast, though, a number of serious news organizations have been pursuing BNL and the Iraqgate story for almost 2 years. And in a campaign where trust has been made into such a central theme, this story is no trivial issue. I'll be back with a program note in a moment.